Hello everyone and welcome again to the Franchise Everything podcast, and today I'm joined by what is an industry veteran by the name of Ben Flintoff, who many in the franchise sector would know. Ben's currently the head of operations APAC for Gong Cha Bubble Tea, which is a brand we're seeing growing in the market. But I wanted to get Ben on today to have a chat about his life and career in franchising business. Welcome, Ben. Thanks for coming on board.
Thanks, Glenn. It's a privilege to be here.
Thanks, mate. We've been trying to pull this together for a while, haven't we?
Yeah, we're both busy.
It's about 4 months or something, isn't it? So, all right. So we go way back, don't we?
We do.
So we'll jump into it. So I came across you. I mean, looking at us now, what we're doing now, how we first met each other, it's a bit of a out-of-the-box sort of story, isn't it? So where did it all start for you in business? Because that's sort of where I came in on it, isn't it?
Yeah, so my first business was as an RFG franchisee. I owned a BB's Cafe, one of their brands at the time.
BB's Espresso, wasn't it?
Correct, in the Brisbane CBD. It was, whilst cafe industry is generally 6 or 7 days, I had the only 5-day cafe in Australia.
And you would that's a winner for you, obviously, with family and lifestyle.
I never knew how lucky I was.
Until now.
Until now.
So that was, so when was that? What year was that?
So 2005, we took over and sold it in 2010.
Yeah. So when I came across you, when I met you, I was like a territory manager. I was like a field manager in that region. What was I like?
You're awesome. I mean,
thank you. You don't have to say that. You don't have to say that.
I think we both had a passion for triathlon at the time.
Yeah, we did.
So that was our connecting piece. And, we always gravitate to people who are like us, I feel.
Yeah. It's funny, isn't it, how when you come across people back later in life doing things, and when you almost had it in a almost a different life at the time you had, because it was a totally different thing, because I was just out of the army at that time. So about what you were like back then, when you really think back, what's about 20 years ago, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a fair while. So, okay, so BB's Espresso, that was your thing there. But let's go back a little bit before then. So what did you start in? Because as I said, now you're the head of operations for Gong Cha for Asia Pacific region, which is a pretty big role. But let's sort of work into how you all got to that now, into that position you're at now. So where did it start for you? What's your story?
Well, as I said, BB's was my first business. Before then, I was an employee. Out of university, I was fortunate enough to be offered graduate program positions at both National Australia Bank and Telstra.
So you're a finance guy?
Yeah, I chose National Australia Bank. And through the graduate program, you got to experience all parts of the bank and then eventually choose which one you are interested in. In Adelaide at the time, I chose the small business lending arm. And from there, moved to Darwin, an opportunity. It was a very innocuous email. Does anyone like to go to Darwin? We've got some spots available. And I responded yes. And 3 weeks later, I was on a plane to Darwin. It happened so quick. It was probably the best thing that could possibly have happened to me, because I met my wife in Darwin.
Wow. So why'd you jump at Darwin? So you were in Adelaide. What made you want to jump out of there?
I think we were offered a significant cash bonus to move.
That always does it.
I'm pretty sure, if I reflect honestly, as a 22.
It's good of you to be so open and honest about it.
So, moved to Darwin and actually was in personal banking on the front line.
Yep. So you did small business in Adelaide and then into personal banking.
Yeah, and enjoyed that time. Transitioned into what was now known as a paraplanner role with the financial planner there. And from there, after Tanya and I married, we moved to London. So
Adelaide, Darwin, London.
Yes.
How did the London opportunity pop up? What was that about?
I think we just had talked about, what our next opportunity looked like. And like every Australian, the opportunity to move to London for a 12-month visa was something. It was almost a rite of passage. At the time, we're talking the late 90s.
Yeah, it was big, wasn't it?
Yeah.
It was big going over and working in London for 12 to 18 months or so.
Correct.
And working in pubs or whatever it is.
Correct. So, and again, I was lucky. I worked in a private bank, and Tanya worked in a stockbroking office. She ran it. They didn't want her to leave. She was far more desirable than I was in my
More
role.
valuable.
Yeah. So private banking there, and also real eye opener. The old money of Europe is such a different beast compared to
how so? What's the differences you saw?
because we're talking generational wealth. They're managing, and they almost have a right and a responsibility to manage it for generations to come. Whereas in Australia, I feel, and The wealth is only newly acquired, and is still, we're still finding our way in that regard.
New money phrase.
We're a new country in
Yeah.
that regard. So I found it incredibly interesting.
Yeah. So was that interesting and different in the way that the people you dealt with, the way they behaved or interacted, or what was that like?
A little bit of both. They certainly interacted with you in a very respectful way, which is unexpected given the amount of money that we were talking about.
Yeah.
But also, I think their expectation about how they should be treated was planting a seed for me that there are different ways to treat different people, but you can be respectful to everyone. So it was a really interesting time for me.
Yeah, and how long were you there doing that in London for?
So we were in London for 12 months. The visa was for 12 months. We were gone for 18 months.
So did you travel around, did you?
Yeah, we did a lot of travelling. We're very, very fortunate. Anyone who gets the opportunity to travel should pick it up. There's so much happening. We live in a wonderful country, but the world is so accessible now. We should be taking those opportunities.
Yeah. So what was the thinking at that time? So you finished there. You travelled 6 months after the job, did you?
Yeah.
What were you thinking through that time about the next progression or next step for you?
Well, I'd taken my new wife out of Darwin, very less than 100,000 people, to Greater London, 9 million people. The thinking was, we're coming back to Australia, but where do we go? And the choice was either Perth or Brisbane. And
why that? Family or
Sydney and Melbourne were big cities, and I think Melbourne will eventually be bigger than Sydney. But we just felt that a slightly smaller city would be more suited to us. I was still doing triathlon at the time and enjoying it, so beach life suited me. But
everyone knows who a triathlete, especially in long. You did Ironman like I did, so Ironman triathlons that's basically your career. That's basically your life, isn't it? Everything revolves around your next training session.
It does, you're right. And the weather is important. I'm a fair weather triathlete. If it's So I wanted. Are
you a fair weather triathlete, were you?
Yeah, I think so.
Were you?
Yeah.
Oh, no. Rain and spray, adding to it.
No, well, you're tougher than me. But Perth, I think, is the most remote city in the world.
Yeah, I've heard that.
And Darwin is remote as well. So Tanya was attracted to Brisbane, and I honestly didn't mind. I felt growing up that if a rock band came to Australia, they tended to go to Brisbane, Melbourne, and Sydney.
Yeah,
so
true.
It seemed to fit.
We
were young. It didn't really matter. I think.
So you don't realise the ramifications of your decisions at that time, do you, for further down the track?
You don't.
Or how permanent something's going to be.
Yeah, exactly. We bought our first house in Brisbane we looked at 3 houses and bought one of them. It was not an in-depth process, and then lived there for 18 years.
You probably bought it for 90 grand or something.
It wasn't as much as it would be now, that's for sure.
Yeah.
Some of the decisions we make can be life-changing, and
Yes.
some of them really are just decisions that you need to move on with.
Yeah. So what year was that?
So 2000.
Okay. So 2000, you're back in Brisbane.
Yep.
And what was the thinking on a career at that time? So when you chose a city, what were you thinking about for what you were going to do? And Tanya as well.
Yeah. Well, I'd enjoyed private banking, and so I became engrossed in financial planning. I took up a paraplanning role at a small financial planning office.
What's paraplanning?
So it's an assistant to a financial planner.
Okay.
Yeah, in
Like
the same way a
essentially.
paralegal's an
Okay.
assistant to a lawyer. Yeah. Not being disrespectful to paralegals, I don't know enough about the role. I'm sure it's incredibly.
There's more to it,
in-depth.
maybe. Yeah. We'll have a lawyer on one day. They can explain to us.
They can. That guy who said, So I was enjoying it, and then I got to a point where I wasn't. I was sitting in front of someone talking to me about a check that they'd just received as a payout from their employer, and asking me how they should invest the money and live the rest of their lives. I was 26. It didn't make any sense.
So you had some lucidity there that you're thinking, maybe am I in a spot to be able to do this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Correct. So it made no sense.
Yeah. It's like what the 21-year-old life coaches.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear people talk about that quite a bit.
No interest in listening to what they have to say.
They've got input, obviously, but
Of course.
from a different context and a different perspective. But there is something to be said for that life experience, isn't there, to to play a role in that sort of advice. And
You pluck a feather from every passing goose.
interesting. Yeah, nice one.
So I think
You're full of phrases, as always.
too many, full of something. I think, I got to a point where I didn't feel like I was the person I was pretending to be. And so I went looking for a business. And
So what was that? How long did that decision take you? So when you got
took
back,
a few years.
because I was going to say you did it for a while, didn't you?
Yeah, I was in financial planning. So I arrived back into Australia in 2000, bubbled around in financial planning for 18 months, had an incredibly understanding employer who I was working hard for, but he could see that it wasn't really working out for me. Gave me 12 months off to go to Canada, which...
For what was the rationale? What was the purpose?
In the Amish community, they take a rum springer, which is when you turn 18.
But you're not Amish, obviously.
I'm not Amish, but you take 12 months off to experience life and then decide which way you're going to go. Interestingly, 90% of them return to the Amish community.
I think isn't there a Netflix show on that? I think
Probably.
I think there's a Netflix show on it. It is interesting stats. Yeah, there is true. That's true.
And it felt like my rum springer. We went to Canada. I worked in a holiday resort. I snowboarded for a season.
Awesome.
We had 36 feet of powder in the season I was there. It was incredible. But
And Tanya went obviously with Tanya.
She was a chalet chef.
Yes.
In the biggest chalet in North America. Something she hadn't done before outside of her comfort zone, and she was amazing at it. Hated the snow, by the way.
Okay, well, it's not a spot to be then.
No, but she took up rock climbing. So, but we had an amazing time there, and I learnt that I was actually quite enjoying the face-to-face contact with the retail and the hospitality industry. So when I returned, I took up my role in financial planning, but immediately was
You were looking for other things.
looking for a business that I could be forward-facing.
So you were certain you wanted to be in your own business.
Yeah,
Is that right? Yep.
yeah. My parents were small business owners, so I knew of that lifestyle. It had taken me a much longer time to get there. My dad was a small business owner before he was 20, whereas it took me a lot longer to reach that point. But the investigation, it was as simple as going on to businessesforsale.com.au.
Was that around then? What year was that? 2005, wasn't it?
2004. I was.
What are going?
With the electronic handshake. Actively looking, and I looked at a range of businesses like dog food distribution and obviously the cafes and service businesses, and ended up buying the BBs in the city.
So why cafes? You like, because you said you like that customer service facing environment and really serving and that sort of stuff, that you can provide a good customer service experience. Is that was what really attracted you, that type of thing?
I feel in hindsight that's my answer. At the time,
I answered it for you.
Yeah. I think at the time I saw a business that was quite broken. But
where was it? CBD, wasn't it?
Yeah, on the corner of Adelaide and Wall Street. It's now an apartment block.
How things change.
Yeah, but at the time, it was interesting because I bought a cafe with a very small catering arm, and I remember the guy was very proud to show me this, second ledger he had with his catering, and I looked at that and I thought, well, that's where the value is. And 5 years later, we sold a catering business basically with a small cafe arm.
Wow, so you transitioned to that business.
Completely transitioned.
I imagine that CBD area there has got a lot of reps coming in, getting lunches for people that you're going to see and visit and stuff like that. I'd imagine a bit of that.
Yeah, absolutely. And the Boeing head office was across the road.
Yeah. And
so very small changes that you can make that impact your entire, guest experience. Boeing employees have American Express cards, and we were one of the very few cafes that accepted American Express.
Yeah, because it was always a thing, wasn't it? Yeah. Do you accept Amex? And I said, no, we don't, because of the charges.
You're right.
Yeah.
And we thought, okay, well, let's just load the charges into our pricing,
Yeah, of course,
and accept the Amex. And
Correct.
suddenly we became the go-to place for everyone from Boeing, basically.
Yeah. So I guess that was your first real taste of franchising then, wasn't it?
Yeah.
So what did you make of franchising early on like that? So when you bought that cafe, was it appealing that it was a franchise, or you were looking broadly and didn't bother you whether it was a franchise or not?
Yeah, I think franchising is for people who want to be in their own business, but not on their own. We've heard that term before. And, a good franchisee is probably not someone who's adept to being an entrepreneur in the pure sense, with the pure white sheet. I like the security of a brand and systems and a process behind it. My passion was more on execution.
Yes.
And a franchising allows that. So there's a certain type of person to be an entrepreneur. I think there's also a certain type of person that can be a franchisee.
Yeah, it's interesting. You do hear that a lot, and you do hear people talk about franchisees being entrepreneurs, which is, I suppose you could argue technically not correct, really. I mean, you can be entrepreneurial as a franchisor, and you can have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 stores, 5 locations and everything, and really start to create that sort of space. But yeah, you're right. I think the strictest sense of an entrepreneur, because it's all provided pretty much, isn't it, as a franchise?
I felt like we were entrepreneurial in some
your
of
approach.
in the way we approached
I agree.
the system.
Yeah.
But I would never pretend that I was an entrepreneur.
Yeah.
I liked the security of having some brand support, a lot of brand support. I know that RFG have certainly had their time in the paper, but my experience with them was positive.
Yeah.
We made money. We certainly had some disagreements. And,
Yes. I remember.
we're on the right side sometimes
Yeah.
and on the wrong side sometimes. But that's part of the tour.
And it's part of business. Yeah, it's part of business with different perspectives and different contexts and different needs and desires for depending on what side of the fence you're on, isn't it? It's an interesting thing I think with franchising that comes around. And the way I like to think about it a lot is that you talk about the security of it, because everything's already there, isn't it? Someone's already done all the development, all the enhancement, all the purchasing, all the buying power, all that sort of stuff. And effectively, I suppose, as that person coming to that business, you're basically giving up, give or take 7 to 12% of what you're taking for that.
Yeah.
For that security. And it's probably at its strictest sense, the easiest way to explain it. That's pretty much what you're giving up.
Yeah, I think that's a very a perfect way to explain. If you want the safety net, a 7% premium is probably a fair exchange
of a franchise fee, weekly, or of takings, So if that's that's a good way to look at it. I think if you're thinking about franchising. Okay, so we had a few interactions there at BB's. I remember, we coming across each other there, and they were big on muffins, weren't they? BB's was huge on muffins. That was their thing.
I think I calculated across the journey I made something like 400,000.
I was going to say you would have made a lot of muffins.
It was, and that was my.
They were great muffins, actually. They were great muffins.
It was, and we'll never.
My wife still talks about those mixed. God, BB's muffins were nice.
They were, and some of the flavors you only had to make 5 or 6 of the most popular ones. You didn't have to make 50 different ones.
No, I think they jumped out of that market too early, actually.
Yeah. Yeah,
I seem to remember a fear then at the time saying, "Oh, muffins are on the way out. No one wants carbs," because remember that carb thing started to come clean and everything like that, and no one wanted to think there was going to be this big reduction in people not wanting to eat carbs anymore. I thought that market was jumped out of way too early for that brand.
Yeah, no, there's definitely still a market for a good muffin.
Yeah, and they're not around at all anymore. Where did BB's go?
If I understand correctly, Retail Food Group folded the BB's brand into the Michelle's Patisserie brand.
It makes sense.
And again, it's probably well documented. I don't
that
have
all
enough background.
Yeah, same. I left there 2006. I think I was in there for a couple of years.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it was interesting. No, I do remember coming out there and meeting you, and I think, what was it? We would have been going through, because I would have been pretty green into it, not that far out of the army. So my retail experience you would have been far exceeding my retail experience at the time.
Yeah, potentially. But I think we all have value to add.
Absolutely, yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah.
Different things. Okay, so next. So BB, how long did you hold that business for?
So 5 years, 5.5 years. My plan was always to get the new lease and sell it. When you buy a business.
And how long was it to go on that lease when you bought it?
So we had 4 years to go when I bought it.
Okay.
my plan was to renew and to sell. So
Yeah.
as soon as I got the renewal, it went on the market.
Yeah. So you're saying that when you buy a new business, you're about to talk about the leasing component of it, were you?
I think when you buy a business, you need to have an exit plan.
Yeah.
I think, and the exit plan may be that you're not exiting, by the way.
But you have a plan.
But you need to have that plan.
It's interesting. I taught in a book we did a few years ago and everything talk about, I think we did a chapter on planning your exit before you buy.
Yeah.
And I don't think it gets talked about enough in franchising, because I think many franchisors I think don't want to talk to incoming franchise owners about how they're going to exit. Well, I think it's a very mature conversation to have about what their plans are for the future, but I don't think it happens enough.
I think you're right. And I think a franchisor that does have that conversation early actually moves himself to a whole new
level,
stratosphere.
Yeah, I think so too.
Wow, this person's trying to get me into their business and then talking about what life is like when I've left it.
Yeah, I think it's powerful.
Very mature.
Yeah, what's it going to look like in 5 years' time?
Yeah.
And I think that certainly brings up, because you end up with situations of people having to come up with $200,000 in a refit in 4 years' time and not having thought about it much beforehand. Yeah. So I think that would avoid those sorts of conversations.
Yeah, and I think the terms of a franchise agreement are always open to scrutiny. But you touched on a particular point. Using materials that have a 25-year lifespan on a 5-year model is something that each and every franchise brand needs to be reviewing constantly.
Yeah. So you're suggesting, why do you have to buy that new piece of equipment just because it's a new piece of equipment to replace 4-year-old equipment that's still working fine?
Or do we actually have to use Caesar stone, which might be replaced in 5 years when that thing's going to last forever?
Yeah. Yeah, I remember that being a key frustration when I was in franchising for a chicken brand that I was in, and going to shopping centres like Westfield and talking to franchise owners who were doing it pretty difficult, and then explaining to them that Westfield didn't like that white tile. Westfield could be anyone.
Yep.
But in this particular instance, they wanted a certain look in the back there, and it was going to cost, I don't know, something like 10 or 15 grand more. And that franchise owner quite rightly was like, well, it doesn't add to my business.
Yeah.
And I think they're very reasonable conversations to be having.
Yeah, the shopping centre requirements over and above the franchise agreement requirements are often even more strict.
And they're profitability draining. They suck profitability out of a franchise owner's business, or any business owner in the centres.
Yep, you're right.
What can we do about it?
We need to keep fighting that fight.
Yeah.
I don't think the voice has been risen to a decibel where it's being heard.
Yeah. No, there's certainly more work on that as far as the leasing code goes. So next there. So BB's was 5.5 years. So you moved that on. So what did the transaction look like? So how did all that go and exiting that business?
I used a business broker. It was pretty seamless. I think businesses should be fit and ready for sale at any time. So we were in, always in exit mode as soon as we bought it. So all the money was going through the till. All the books were being kept correctly.
No big shopping for home and everything like that out of it.
No, and look, certainly we managed our finances correctly, but it was very clear how the business was being operated, and it could be taken over by someone with the systems, A, that we'd inherited from the brand, and B, that we'd implemented at the store. So I felt like we sold a very good business, and we did well from it as well. Excellent. I think if you work hard and you do the right thing, you deserve to be rewarded.
Totally agree. Yeah.
And when we sold that business, it was my plan to take some time off. And I was driving around, my version of driving around Australia, which from Brisbane is basically driving directly to Adelaide and then back up the east coast.
Yes.
So we missed a fair bit of Australia. And about a quarter of the way through that, a good friend of mine rang me and he said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, nothing." He said, "Well, come up here, I need you to help me." And he was an executive chef at the Cirame winery just out in Mount Cotton. And they had a very successful 5-star restaurant, Lillian's. And the cellar door was just doing cheese and olive platters at the time. And he said, "I want to put in a full lunch menu here.
And you're the man.
And you're the guy who's going to help me do it." I said, "Okay." So we built a kitchen and we served 500 people on the first day. And we looked at each other and thought, we need a bigger kitchen. And so I stayed there for 9 months,
Yeah.
reshaping.
So you remodeled the kitchen, got a new kitchen in there?
Remodeled it.
Yeah.
I won't take any credit for the menu because I had an executive chef, as my boss.
Yeah.
But, I put the systems in place. And then during that time, a person who was my national operations manager at BB's was recruited to Baskin-Robbins. And he rang me and said, "What
You
do
say
you
who
do?"
that was?
Simon Fraser.
Simon Fraser.
Yeah.
I reckon he actually, so I'm going to cut you there. Blast from the past, actually, because I used to work with him at Retail Food Group. I think I did some work with him and got him in a chapter in of a book we did that I reckon he was probably the best field manager I've ever seen in franchising.
I agree.
He just cared so much.
I agree.
He really did.
And I was so lucky to have him as my direct, BDM at the time.
Yeah, I learned a heap from him.
Unbelievable. And I think what I learned most from Simon was knowing your numbers. If you were aware of how your business was operating, then you could make changes. And I think, when we get too old to play sport, we play business. And that was the game that he taught me.
Yeah, it's interesting. The key thing that jumps out to me from Simon that I learned from him was that he told me that, talking about feedback he'd get from his franchise owners when he got some anonymous feedback and that sort of stuff, was that the number one thing that keeps popping up for him that he wanted to pass on to me was that franchise owners say that, Simon, you always answer your phone. When I call, you always answer your phone. You don't let it go to voicemail. You don't do whatever. He always is responsive and how he can help, which was good. Well, we don't answer our phones a lot now.
You're right.
Mostly.
You're right.
Many of us are all guilty of it.
Yeah. I think, again, are we screening them or are we just preoccupied?
Busy doing something else, doing other tasks.
Yeah,
Bit of both, I think.
I feel like I'm pretty good at answering. I'll certainly still respond before the end of the day.
Yeah.
And interestingly, where I am now, the discipline is the same.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's lost. I don't think it's lost.
It's funny though, but it can be a surprise when someone answers their phone. So, wow, he answered. Thank you for taking my call. Such as thank you for taking my call. It's a funny thing, isn't it?
So Simon had been recruited as the national training manager at Baskin-Robbins, and they were building a team, Allied Brands.
That's based out of Brisbane?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, Allied Brands had just collapsed and Duncan had taken back the market to operate it.
Yep.
And so they were recruiting a team, and they had a operations manager in place. GM had just been recruited, and Simon was the third person, very small team. Anyway, he had said to the GM, "I know a guy who should come in and do operations. He's the best operator I've ever seen." Pretty hefty praise given what we just said about him. And the initial response was, "No, let's get the strategy right first," which is a fair response from a very experienced GM. But then Simon had to go to America to do the Duncan training, and he needed someone to manage his phone, hold his phone. And so I had the opportunity to, on a contract basis, hold his phone for a period of time. Ideally, it seems I did a good job. So I was offered a contract position
with Baskin-Robbins.
Yeah. And I was in a full-time role and offered a contract position. And I had young family, so it was. Well, this is a little bit of a risk, but it was one I wanted to take. And I took up the contract role with Baskin-Robbins in the state, so the Queensland State Operations role, and I did well. So 6 months later, I was offered a full-time role. The same day that I offered my full-time role, Julian Casa started as the national marketing manager.
He was marketing, yeah.
And he now operates that business.
Yeah.
So
how long were you there for?
So 10 years.
10 years.
First in state operations, and then as the national operations manager, and then finally as the general manager.
Yeah, and that's where we looped back around, didn't we? So we came across each other again after, what was it, 12 years or something? Ben?
We never forgot each other.
No.
We just hadn't connected.
No, not at all. So what was that like at Baskin? So Baskin has got a bit of a different structure here in Australia, isn't it? It's owned. Yeah. It's a licensed model run here with a smaller team and based from overseas. How does that work?
So as I mentioned, the the collapse of Allo Brands meant Duncan Brands took back the market. I think it's not properly understood in Australian franchising that if a franchisor fails, the franchisees are still franchisees, but they might become franchisees of the administrator or franchisees of the controller.
To a different structure.
Duncan were very quick to take the market back,
Yeah.
and operated it for 3 years. So from October 2010 until June 2013. And then they sold it to their largest franchisee in a different market. So the Galladari brothers at the time were operating well over 600 stores in the Middle Eastern region. They now operate over 1,000 stores, including Australia.
Yes.
And so based in Dubai, they brought in a general manager who did not last very long, like 4 months, not very long. And then they brought in a replacement for him, who I worked under as a national operations manager. And when he eventually left, I was offered the opportunity to step up to the general manager role.
And how did that Baskin role and that product offer and that niche, how did that differ from what your previous experience has been, and what were the main differences you saw in that space?
In the
say to your cafe experience, especially in your cafe franchise experience, what were the differences like between those two brands?
Well, we all need to eat 3 times a day, breakfast, lunch and dinner commonly. We don't need to eat ice cream. We love to eat ice cream, and ice cream's delicious, but we don't. If you got to the end of the day and didn't have an ice cream, you don't sort of...
Oh, ice cream makes a happy day, though, doesn't it?
So we're playing in a completely different space. It's a luxury, a treat, nice to have, a dessert that's it's not compulsory. And I found that a really interesting change from coming from basically coffee.
From a daily staple almost.
Where people would walk into your store almost in a zombie-like state. In fact, my wife used to tell me that people who hadn't had coffee were basically zombies waiting to be caffeinated. And
Partly true.
Being a coffee drinker myself,
same.
it's hard to
argue with that.
Argue with it. So people who are basically tapped to come past your address at a certain time every single day, to people who might come once a month, was a completely different experience for me in terms of how do we attract these people and stay relevant in a space that it's becoming much more competitive as well. Gelato was starting to hit the scene. Bubble tea, ironically, which I didn't pay too much attention to at the time.
Which makes a lot of sense later on.
Yeah. Had obviously started to have an impact as well. And so different ways to treat ourselves. And also we weren't competing, McDonald's compete with Hungry Jack's, compete with Subway, compete with. We weren't competing with that. We were competing with, do I take my kids to the cinema or to Waterworld?
As that treat.
Correct.
For that discretionary spend.
Those last $10 in my wallet, how do I spend that? Or probably the last $20 in your wallet these days. It was a different mindset that we had to work with.
So how did you approach that? So what was the thinking around that? How does that work in that sort of niche to get that spend happening and get on, I suppose, more regular?
Well, the first thing, and this wasn't my idea, but it was a great idea, was we started to talk about our customers as guests, being invited as if we would invite them into our homes. And we were talking about experience, 15 years ago, which was important at the time, and is more and more relevant now. Like, how do you retain relevance? It's not just the product. It never has been. We've finally worked it out. Yeah,
it's certainly come to a more of a general realisation across the board, hasn't it?
And
that product is not the only thing that matters.
And Baskin-Robbins' international promise is to offer you a taste of the flavour of the month through the Pink Spoon trial.
Yep.
The franchise partners that were doing that and doing it well, and importantly having their team members do it and do it well, were the ones that were succeeding.
Yeah, those ones who welcome that and don't do it begrudgingly.
Yeah.
I imagine were they ones that do it begrudgingly? Was that a problem?
Yeah. And
that's the key of sampling.
Yeah, they didn't see the value and probably paid the price in that regard, because you don't get the extra scoop or the topping or the waffle cone upgrade. And it's not even about trying to sell more to the person standing in front of you. If you're offering trials of flavors, I worked out that if I was going into a Baskin Robbins, I knew what I was going to get. But if I was offered a flavor, it might be something that I would come back the next time for.
Yeah.
So it actually created frequency based on what we understood of our business.
So, and what were some of the other approaches that you talked about? So was that key around sampling and getting people, or being very open and welcoming of that? What sort of other things were the main focus for the business?
Well, as I took in the GM role, the one thing that we needed to get very good at very quickly was digital execution. So we rolled out a loyalty app by the end of 2017. So I was GM in August 2016 is when I started. And by the end of 2017, we'd rolled out a loyalty app. And at the same time, we were already looking at the delivery business. And again, for those listening who are franchisees, whilst a lot of credit for the delivery business is given to myself and to Julian, the actual idea came from a franchisee. And it wasn't an idea in a positive sense. It was, we've discovered this guy's using a delivery app. We've got to go and find out what's going on. And so we showed up to the store to understand he was using Foodora at the time, which has since failed, to understand how the mechanics of the business worked and how they were, providing, food safety to the door of, of the purchaser.
Yeah, because that delivery system was far less developed across the board at that time, isn't it? Now you look at the food safety, simple things in place like sealed bags with special stickers on them and all that sort of stuff there. That wouldn't have been in place at that time.
No way.
Yeah.
Not even a patch on the systems that the aggregators, to their credit, have implemented to ensure some positive food safety standards are held. And what we discovered was that the franchisee wasn't protecting their margins. And it's the easiest.
So it wasn't a food safety issue, or that was part of it, but it was mainly the margins issue.
We're actually quite comfortable with the bagging that was being done and the way, it was the equivalent of putting a take-home pack into your car.
Yeah.
Which, if you took a take-home pack home, it had to get there somehow. So the actual food safety issue didn't raise its ugly head in the way we were expecting. But what we discovered was they were only charging a very tiny premium for delivery. And we explained to the franchisee that the worst possible thing that could happen is that their very regular customers work out that they now deliver and sit on their couch watching State of Origin and order delivery to their door.
Eats away at that margin.
Correct. So we implemented a model that was profitable for the franchisees and viewed delivery as an incremental piece of our business, which it was. And the numbers speak for itself. We had, done the work in 2018 and 2019. Everyone knows.
Little did you know it was going to have such an impact afterwards.
With no inclination. Anyone who says they did, I would love to know how. We had no inclination of where this was headed. And so March 2020, when I heard of competitors and other players in the QSR business talking about reviewing the opportunity to launch delivery, and I was thinking, well, we've just spent 18 months launching delivery.
Very timely.
So
very lucky.
Very, very lucky. But it was, again, to my earlier point, it was based on a franchisee who was being entrepreneurial in their own store.
There's that entrepreneurial thing, absolutely.
And I think franchisors have an obligation to look at what's being done. And when a franchisee is trying to dodge a system or to implement something that's not yet approved or whatever the terminology the franchisor has, ask why. And is it actually value add, or is this person a squeaky wheel?
Instead of instant shutdown mode.
Correct.
Yeah, understand more about it.
Yeah, most of the best ideas come from the field.
Yeah.
Let's face it, at BB's I was serving 400 people a day. I think I'm going to have some pretty good insights as to what should be sold versus the national operations manager sitting in his desk in an office who might get to a store for a couple of hours a week, and potentially in a quiet period because they want to catch the franchise partner. Like, it's a completely different
you only see so
understanding.
much. Yeah. So the Baskin-Robbins thing, how did that finish up, and where to from that? Because there's been a different change since then as well. So what was the move from there?
Yeah. So when I left Baskin-Robbins, I think I'd run my time, and I think leaders do need to change. The beauty of my parting was there was a person in my team who was able to be lifted up, and that was a really wonderful occasion. To lift someone up into your team, into your role.
Yep.
And so
some succession planning for it.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so Julian had been the national marketing manager and an unbelievably successful national marketing manager. He had digital awards and marketing.
I saw that he had
awards.
Stranger Things campaigns and also integrated marketing strategies and stuff through.
His fingerprints are over the success of that business for years to come.
Maybe it was the Barbie campaign template that we see, that you see now. Yeah, it was because it's a fair while ago that he was doing those sorts of things, wasn't it?
You're right.
It wasn't recent.
Well, he was employed as the marketing manager in 2011.
Yeah.
He did have a period away, but when he rejoined the business, I think it really accelerated. He got his ducks in a row, as they say.
Yeah.
Had a great agency supporting him with the initiatives. And he'll never pretend it's a one-man show. He's got a great team there now as well, as far as I'm led to believe. So to lift him into the GM role, I'd been recognised for my work turning around the business, and that was personally satisfying. But I also needed to, scratch an itch, as they say, and I'd been looking into the renewable energy and the sustainability field for quite some time. I took a move into a startup in Australia. It was a business that existed already in other parts of the world and wanted to bring the technology into Australia. I didn't succeed.
What field of what part of sustainability was it in? What was
it was in energy efficiency of office buildings.
I remember when you called me and told me you were doing it. You're saying you're moving from Baskin and you're doing this. I said, you're doing what?
Yeah.
You're not franchising? What?
Yeah, correct. Didn't succeed. The business still operates, and I think given enough time, it will run into success.
So what was your version of success with it? What was the measure?
For me, I had a very clear timeline of, in 12 months, how many clients we needed to have onboarded in using this technology to get a subset of data in Australia of what efficiencies we were generating that were, carbon efficient to start with, cost efficient is always important. And then it would open up the landscape for that technology.
Yeah.
It still has a place. There's no question. But I wasn't the right person for that. And once I acknowledged that, it became simple enough for me to make an exit from that business.
Was it difficult for you to acknowledge that? Did you struggle over it?
I've got an ego. And acknowledging that you were wrong, especially to your family. They're the ones who support you. And I left a job that I was doing very well to go and do something that I didn't do very well. It's hard.
It's funny when you spoke to me that you were leaving Baskin and you were going to go and do this. Because it was clearly like a passion project. That was what the sense that I got from it. That it was a pure passion project into a space that you had no exposure or experience into. You just really wanted to go and do it because you thought you could have an impact. Was my memory of a conversation with you.
And I think that's an accurate description. I really was a fish out of water. However, because of the experiences that I had, I was able to get the business into the right rooms. Like we had some unbelievably high-level conversations with some really, really big businesses, ASX 20 businesses. However, getting that final, commitment to the program was I didn't have the tools, and probably would never have the tools. You're talking an electrical engineer type mindset for this. And so it became obvious.
Was that to explain the features and benefits?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. I could arrange the meeting and the venue and the seating, as they say in Hamilton. But
I haven't seen it.
Yeah.
Heard a lot about it.
Worth watching. But in terms of actually sitting down and talking the turkey, it wasn't for me. So exit stage left, as they say, to continue with the theatrical theme, and very fortunate that I've kept a great cohort in the franchise network, and I was offered a consulting role for a franchise for several months, which I readily accepted and enjoyed. And during that time, the team at Gongcha reached out to me, and again, the relationships you keep and the network that you have means that opportunities become available. And when I first was contacted about Gongcha, I didn't really know enough about the business. And then when I went and had a look, I was like, wow, how long has this been going on?
I know, and you called me around that time, amongst other people I know, to chat with them and said, what can you tell me about bubble tea and Gongcha? And I said, sorry, what?
Yeah.
I didn't know of it at all, didn't know of the brand. And that's why I've always said when we've done a little bit of Gongcha stuff, that very much under the radar.
Very much.
I think.
Yeah, and you've now met Lily and talked to her. 150 stores now.
Amazing.
In less than 12 years.
But that acceleration over the last 3 is really the big thing, isn't it?
Incredible. And like during COVID, I think we at Baskin Robbins built one store.
Yeah.
She built 20.
Yeah.
It's
crazy.
Just unbelievable. So, and a category that won't go away. Tea's the second most consumed beverage behind water. But bubble tea globally, yeah. But bubble tea is only a subset of that, and I believe there's a product on the menu for every single person. It's just my job now to make the business inviting enough for people to want to try.
So is that what is the focus of your role? So what's your brief for APAC as far as operations go?
I think unashamedly the business has grown out of an Asian-centric demographic. That makes sense. It's heritage is from Taiwan. It's proliferate through Thailand and Vietnam and Philippines and all of these Southeast Asian countries. It makes sense to have the product in Australia because we're growing Asian demography. However, as I said, there's a product on the menu that you and I will like, but we just don't know enough. Like when McDonald's got started, we all knew what a burger was, and it was just a matter of going and trying it. Whereas here, I need to find a way to bring the new demographic or
towards the product.
Well,
it is interesting. When we went down and did interviews with Lily at Gongcha HQ, it was the first full bubble tea that I'd had. When I had there, and the only other time I think we'd sampled it was at a franchising expo when there was bubble tea brands walking around there, because there's no inclination to do it. Out of there, you don't go get a coffee, you go get a cold drink, you do whatever, or get a frappuccino or whatever it might be, because you're used to all that stuff.
Yeah.
But I suppose that is the challenge, isn't it, with bubble tea, spreading the demographic.
Yeah.
For consumption.
And it's happening.
I'm sure it is.
I met with our local Runcorn franchise partner just this week, and he
in Brisbane,
Brisbane, and he mentioned that he felt his demographic was around 60% Caucasian, which is by far the biggest number that I've heard in our business. So as we select locations that are outside of those traditionally Asian focused locations, and also the major shopping centres, then we need to make sure that the brand and the business is relevant to the way Caucasians and other Westerners like to choose their products. Lily's got her first Middle Eastern franchise partner joining the business next month.
Wow.
So it's exciting times for her. It really is. I'm able to share some knowledge, but also grow with her and the business. So it's exciting.
So with APAC, how many countries then are you personally looking after or advising, and what sort of travel and all that sort of stuff is involved with that?
So I have direct responsibility for Australia and New Zealand.
Okay.
My boss is in Taiwan, and although I think he's based in a plane, the amount of travel he actually does. But his role as CEO for APAC region is to cover all of Southeast Asia. And I support him wherever I can, especially in the business planning part. I've been to Taiwan a couple of times. Next year, I plan to get to Thailand and to other parts of that geography as well. But Australia and New Zealand are actually quite a big part of the APAC business. And so I think he's very happy that he's got someone here
on the ground here,
very focused on what is about 30 or 40% of the APAC store number.
So what's it? You've pretty much in your franchising senior management roles, you've worked with international HQs pretty much most of the time. What have you learnt out of that? What stands out to you about working in a different country to actually where you report to? What are the differences you think? I mean, I suppose you haven't worked in a normal environment, have you, with an HQ here in Sydney or something like that, have you?
No.
So I'm asking you to tell me what the differences are and you haven't had the other side to it. It's interesting.
I think the one thing which must be common is to understand who your true customer is. Like I know now that my customer is my boss. And if I can help make his role, or in other cases her role, easier, or make them deliver on their own KPIs more positively, that can only be a good thing. But you need to understand what they are. Like if their motivations are about a completely different tangent than you've been spending, your weeks and months on, then you've completely missed the brief.
Yeah, totally.
And so it's really important to have that, that check-in from time to time. I use WhatsApp a lot because it works. I find email a little cumbersome. I think picking up the phone and having just a quick conversation to close potentially language barriers as well as understanding barriers is really important. So, in Dubai, my boss would probably speak English out of respect, but I think, Arabic would be his preferred language.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
I've sat in business plan meetings where they've said we need to speak in English because Ben's here.
Do you feel like, sorry, everyone?
No, I don't. I feel humbled.
Okay.
Because
they're putting in the effort for.
They are. And it is an effort. It's a slower meeting because from time to time you may turn to someone and explain what you've just said in English again in the mother language to make sure the point is made. But I think that's an incredible gift that true leaders give. If they're willing to acknowledge that there's one person important enough to them to distract the whole meeting in a different language, I think that's a gift that you need to acknowledge. And I thanked obviously my boss for that after the call. I think when you're learning in different languages, relying on Google Translate, but also acknowledging that it's not perfect is important.
Yeah. You want to send some wrong messages. And
if you can take something the right way or the wrong way, just take it the right way and assume that the wrong way was lost in translation.
Yeah.
I've found, because, again, I've dealt with cultures from India, from Egypt, obviously because Dubai is full of Egyptian and Indian culture. And right now, with the head office in Taiwan, it's full of the Southeast Asian nationalities, mainly Chinese, is the language mainly spoken. But even in Lily's head office, they'll speak Chinese, but they've got one gentleman who just doesn't understand it. And he's a really important person in the business. So their whole business is going to change in that regard as well. So it's
interesting. It's an international franchising world.
It really is. Computers have made it very simple. Like I use Google Translate all the time. My HR releases come out in Chinese.
Wow.
And I literally just do it.
It really takes some getting used to.
Yeah. But, the first time it comes out, you can either throw up your hands and go, well, I can't read this, or you can
find a proactive way around it.
And get 90% of the intent and check what you said this here, what does that actually mean? And, you're pretty safe.
That's fascinating, mate. That's something that people wouldn't have thought of, I reckon.
No, I didn't think of it either. To be honest.
Maybe you should have. Excellent, mate. Well, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast today, mate. Love chatting with you. You've got such a diverse experience in franchising and many other things you bring to the table. So I'm sure your whole network benefits greatly from your input and experience, mate. Much appreciated. Thanks for coming on board today.
Glenn, it's been a thrill to be here. And can I just say that the franchise buyer business that you've built and I've watched build over the last decade is a gift to this community. I think those who don't know about you should do a little bit more research. The value you bring, often of your own goodwill, but not always, and it shouldn't be, I think is something that we won't properly understand the value until maybe another decade has gone by.
Thanks, mate. Appreciate that.
Yeah, so
thanks very much. Thanks very much. And if you like Franchise Everything podcast and everything we do, I never say this, please do like, subscribe, leave a review, leave comments, engage. Even if you didn't like something, just let us know. We'll have a chat about it. Please do engage. We'd love it. We'd really appreciate your support if you'd love to see us keep creating content just like this. And we'll catch you again the next one soon.